Is social media addictive? Is it dangerous? And did social media companies know and decide to market it to children anyway? Or is social media just a delivery system for plain old constitutionally protected free speech? Welcome to the Reason Roundtable. This is your libertarian review of news and culture from the editors of Reason magazine. I'm your host, Peter Suderman, and today I am joined, as always, by my colleagues Catherine Mangue-Ward, Matt Welch, and Nick Gillespie. Nick, I want to start with you. There were two court judgments last week against Meta, and then in California, it was also against Google. One was in New Mexico for $375 million, another in California for $6 million. In the grand scheme of things, not a ton of money for these social media companies to pay. But the core of the argument that was made here is the slogan version is social media is like tobacco. It's addictive, it's harmful. Companies know that, and they pushed it on kids anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, it makes you look cool, and you can use your camel bucks on Instagram. Your
it's
old
toasted.
Camel bucks, redeem them. Yeah, it is. We've reached a tipping point, I think, or I worry of where the arguments against social media, which are ultimately going to be fought in a cultural arena rather than a political or even a scientific one. We've reached a place where people are like, I am fed up with the world enough and I'm going to take it out on social media. If you look at the civil trial in Los Angeles in particular, because this is a pure case of where a young woman who's 20 now said that at ages 6 and 9, she started using YouTube and Instagram and has social media addiction and a bunch of mental health problems. She was able to convince a jury to give about $6 million. The judge may change that. But on the grounds that social media did this to her, when you look at the testimony that she gave both at the trial and at depositions, anybody looking at that would be like, there's no way you can blame this on social media. She grew up in a horrific childhood situation where her father left the family and had been physically and psychologically abusive. The mother who stayed was psychologically abusive throughout. This is bad. And the key argument that has been made and was successful in both of these cases is that it's not about speech, it's not about content, it's about design. And that the design of things like, the continual scroll and auto playing the next video on something like YouTube, that these are endlessly addictive and therefore are also not covered by things like Section 230. That is an argument which is false on the face of it, because if Instagram, and this is something I talked with Taylor Lorenz last week, and I've seen other variations of this argument, if Instagram was just images of paint drying or of pink squares, one after the other, nobody would continue watching it. It is the content. So the idea that design is the problem, I think it's momentarily victorious, but it is wrong. And this is a huge battle now for free speech.
Yeah, Catherine, I want to ask you about this argument that it's design features, because this is how they get around the free speech protection part of it, right? If they said, well, it's about the speech, then obviously that's not legally actionable. But what they're saying is that because they are using casino-style design features that are designed to hook people, designed to reel them in and make sure that they keep spending their time with social media, it's the design features. But think about it. If you had infinite scroll of, I don't know, paint drying or me talking about pizza, it wouldn't be addictive, right?
Hypothetically.
It would be the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah, people would want to turn off.
And go have some pizza, maybe, which is the argument, I guess. So I think that this is just, we are going to see a proliferating number of novel arguments to try and get around the fact that you can say whatever you want in this country, and that is one of our most cherished rights. So there's going to be its design. There's going to be, we've already seen another decision where there's a question of fraud, right, which would be another way in here, particularly in terms of the advertisements that are present on Meta products. Maybe Meta helped make those advertisements and so is responsible for the fraud. We're gonna keep looking for new ways in. There's a ton of money to be had to the person who phrases the argument just right. And as long as that incentive exists, we're just going to keep fighting about this. I do think, social media is really compelling and well designed. So I don't want to leave that. Like, it's true, an infinite scroll of paint drying wouldn't, probably call to me, but I consume a lot more social media because of the infinite scroll, for sure. Like, I set a time limit on my phone to be like, don't look at this junk for more than half an hour because I'll keep looking. So I do want to give kind of credence to that thing. Like, it is powerful and it is well designed.
It's well designed, but how is that different, Catherine? How is that different from what media companies, publishers of serial fiction that put a cliffhanger at the end of the story have been doing for decades? Of course, media companies want to take up your time. They're trying to sell you a product. That's what the New York Times does when they have you jump to the next story, when they put a bunch of headlines on the front page. They are designed to make their product enjoyable to use.
Yeah, and this is also an argument that Jacob Sullum wrote about a lot. We talked about this a couple weeks ago about food, right? Like, food is designed to be delicious and make you want to keep eating it, especially at places that were accused of, what was that term? Hyperpalatability. Was that the term?
Yes.
It was like Olive Garden is just making these meatballs hyper palatable in this like sugary, salty, fatty way that makes you want to keep eating them.
Yes, they're literally putting salt and fat in it.
Sneaky. So, of course, this is not a new invention to make things a compelling product that people want to consume. But I do think sometimes it is tempting to be like, just turn it off, just walk away. And like, absolutely yes, from a moral and legal perspective, but aesthetically, it's compelling.
The argument is also that, it's the phone. The phone is qualitatively different than a book or a magazine that comes the next week or anything like that, right? Or even a TV show, and that it's directed at kids. I mean, it's meaningful that the restrictions that are sticking are designed at kids. And, Facebook or Meta and YouTube both have rules saying that if you're below 13, you're not supposed to have an account. So on that level, they might be liable for not following their own terms of service somehow. But, this is all directed at kids because we all get a little bit weaker when we talk about kids. And it also makes it a little bit more compelling. But the science is not fully clear. And this is something, Jonathan Haidt, who's a friend of reason and has written a lot about this, says, no, the science is settled. And this is exactly like tobacco. And kids are particularly, vulnerable, and they're dying not to be on social media. So we should start doing a bunch of policies that, unfortunately, among other things, have real effects on the rest of us. And the science is not settled.
Yeah, Matt, this is the Jonathan Haidt argument in legal form, right? It's dangerous. They knew it was dangerous, and they targeted kids anyway.
Yeah, they knew. He's very excited about that. I once recall, or maybe we all recall, when the CEO of either Coke or Pepsi, probably Coke, said, "Well, our market share is potentially limitless because humans ingest 64 ounces of fluid a day, and only one of them, on average, is Coke. So we got a lot of upside right there." And people were horrified. Like, well, yeah, of course he's going to say that. It sounds horrible, but that's his job, is to make you drink all the Coke, even if it's really bad for you, if you drink that much Coke. Okay, now what? I get the idea that it sucks to have your 17-year-old daughter just putting an age and a gender on a hypothetical.
What, do we maybe give a first initial of the name just to,
like literally
anonymize the
go
data?
to sleep without blaring YouTube videos of horrible influencers named Clavicular. Like, I get you want to take a howitzer and blow something up. But you should always remember in these processes that the Supreme Court is littered with a lot of bones of attempts to, usually by Hillary Clinton, to limit and protect or limit speech in the name of protecting children. I mean, the Communications Decency Act tried to do that to begin with in 1996. She also tried video game stuff. California did video game stuff. There was an attempt to crack down on the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, believe it or not. That all happened. And time again, the Supreme Court was the backstop of this, saying, nope, can't really just do that. So you should get your policy revenge fantasies out in places where it actually makes sense. Get phones out of classrooms. get a Yonder pouch, get phones out of the Bob Dylan concert, which was one of the greatest things I ever saw because there were no phones and people had to like look at the concert. That sounds fun, and especially when it's actually a voluntary type of thing. But in schools, which is a K through 12 government policy, you get them out of the classroom, totally fine. Even
are schools voluntary, Matt Welch?
Never. Even when you start talking about age gating, which is also all the rage everywhere. Australia just did it for 16-year-olds. A lot of states, Utah, others are doing it. Then that's where you get to the Nick Gillespie problem of, okay, does that mean that everyone over the age of 16 now has to like do a retinal scan of their eyeball before getting on Twitter? And that's a problem. So you have to understand and take heed of the constitutional free speech issues on this. David French has a column in the New York Times that basically sketches out close to where my position on this is, which is like, yeah, social media and phones can be a problem, especially for teens. And also we have a constitution and we're going to follow that.
I remain deeply, deeply happy about the decision that I made to instead of writing a book about the history of bad policy arguments that are made in the name of for the children, I instead had a child. And that was the right decision. But I do sometimes wish that I had written that book just to have it present
Raise
for
the child.
all the
They can be uppity sometimes. To be honest.
Yes, because it is such a long-standing and powerful history to be like, we have to protect the children, and actually, it's just a backdoor way of limiting adults' freedom. I
mean, isn't this so similar to the arguments that, Catherine, you and I heard when we were kids about rap music lyrics, about Quentin Tarantino movies, about Mortal Kombat, right? Reservoir Dogs and Mortal Kombat.
No, Peter, because this time it's different.
Yes.
The this time it's different of this is very powerful, even to people who have previously had immunity to this time it's different arguments. And we gotta grapple with that.
I mean, it was true, in fact, that Mortal Kombat was uniquely violent relative to previous video games. Mortal Kombat and Doom really set new, they blazed new trails of bloodiness in video games. You could not rip the head off of your opponent in previous, two-player fighting games until that happened. It was unique. It was new. It was novel. And guess what? It was fine. We're fine. So here I am.
Are you?
To steelman that a little bit, one argument that could be made is that during the video game freakout, crime started dropping. Violent crime in particular started dropping precipitously. And people like Haidt and there are countless, politicians, whole countries have done this. Say, at the same time, we are seeing, mental health indicators of young people plummeting. And it's because of the phone. Like they'll say, it all starts in 2012, and that's when smartphones became ubiquitous. So I obviously agree with you. I think any restrictions that are put on commercial products really need to pass the highest bar possible. And it should not mean that, adults have to start showing ID in order to be in places where we should be free to be in order to, for children's sake. But if we're doing that, and when you talk to psychologists, developmental psychologists, and this includes people like Candace Odgers at UC Irvine, as well as people like Chris Ferguson at Stetson, they point to, a wide variety of studies that show that the decline in certain mental health indicators that, has been happening, it is not social media linked. What is fascinating, to go back to this case in LA, during the depositions of the plaintiff, whose name, she was called KGM or Kaylee throughout, her full name was not disclosed. Her therapist did not bring up social media as an issue, like with her body image problems and eating disorders, because her life was so terrible. And in fact, there are reasons to believe that she, like a lot of other kids, found some measure of community and help and solve from being able to discuss this stuff on social media. So, the reality is complicated. And I really fear, when you look at, whole continents like Australia, a bunch of states in the US are now saying, okay, we have enough data. This is the time to put the fix in. As Matt, mentioned, the Communications Decency Act, that passed overwhelmingly in the, with massive bipartisan support. And it was all done on the backs of there's nothing but porn on the internet and kids are going to be, porn addicts. And it was only struck down by the Supreme Court. The legislative branch failed. The presidential executive office failed. So we have a real fight on our hands here. And it worries me deeply because it's against a much larger backdrop of a recession in free speech around the globe. Every time we have the technology to be able to say what we want, whenever we want to, there's always the backlash, and this is it.
Can I be a little Sazian for a minute as well?
Do people know who
I'm
Saz
gonna explain.
is?
Let me explain. So Thomas Saz, who wrote for Reason, and Reason wrote about his work a lot in his heyday, raised a bunch of, I think, very powerful and interesting questions about the relationship between kind of official diagnoses of mental illness and social and political control. And he had quite a radical view, and basically he called it the myth of mental illness. But I think you don't have to be a full-fledged Sazian to note with interest and fear the way that political powers that be use the labels of mental illness to constrain people's individual liberty. And I think a big difference between the violent crime was declining during video games, but measures of mental illness are going in bad directions during the rise of the smartphone is our measures of mental illness are much less scientific than knowing whether someone has done a murder. Like much less scientific. The categories are hard. At the very least, the controversy over the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Illnesses, is ongoing, and we see this popping up in other places in the law, like red flag laws, which are restrictions on gun ownership based on sometimes on mental illness diagnoses. This is a super slippery slope. Like, you're a teenage girl and you're depressed, you perhaps lose your rights to consume and speak on the internet. Sounds bad to me. I would like depressed teenage girls to have maximal free speech. I don't want to listen to them, but I want them to be able to speak, and I want them to be able, more importantly, to read and consume and watch what is out there.
So I actually want to just twist this a little bit and ask you about kids and sexual material here, because this was part of the case, and
I think you're directing this to Matt, then, right?
To
kids
Catherine,
and sexual material.
To Catherine,
as a mom, go ahead.
Because in the New Mexico case, part of it was about child sexual exploitation material, right? Like stuff that is pretty awful, pretty terrible. And the argument was, as I understand it, that was there because it's a platform, as a result of platform features, which that's the part that seems crazy to me, that it's Facebook's fault, that it's Meta's fault, that it's Instagram's fault, whatever, that these companies are responsible rather than the individuals who are using the platforms to trade illicit, illegal material. Yeah.
I mean, I think, we've talked on this podcast about the kiddie porn exception to the Constitution, which, becomes more robust every day. This idea that, that form of speech, and again, I'm separating here the speech from the act, right? Like, nobody in their right mind is saying that doing the sexual abuse, producing that material, anything like that should be legal, is legal. It's not. But we have this horror of this, rightly, and it causes us to kind of lose perspective on other rights from time to time. And I think this idea that the platforms are being negligent or even encouraging the presence of this material it's basically a conspiracy theory. Like, it's a deeply insane thing to think. Like, we saw this, of course, with the Backpage case, where Reason's Elizabeth Nolan Brown did a ton of reporting on the fact that even as the government was prosecuting the owners of Backpage, they had tons of evidence that Backpage was working as hard as it could to keep that material off their site,
including statements from law enforcement.
Right. Yeah. And we know that is also true with these other platforms. What kind of monsters would they be to be building huge publicly traded companies, platforms in a way that this material is part of their business plan? That's simply not the case. Now, are there bad operators? Of course. Should those people be prosecuted for doing illegal stuff with kids? Oh my God, yes, of course. But
go after the individuals, not the companies who are providing a neutral platform that you can do whatever you want.
It is a crazy idea to imagine that Mark Zuckerberg is waking up in the morning and being like, you know what seems cool? Kitty porn. He's not. And that's nuts.
Yeah. Matt Welch, what about the kind of just larger cultural argument here, right? These cases are coming at a time sort of as it seems like there's been a kind of a reckoning with social media in the culture where people are just saying the whole thing, the 2010s, which was the social media decade, the phones decade. It was all a mistake. It didn't just hurt our kids. This is part of the argument is it hurt our politics. It gave rise to Donald Trump. You will hear this, right? That social media, polarized people and made fascism more popular. But even in our world, you see people who say social media gave rise to woke and that you can't have a social media mob without social media. How do you situate these cases in the context of that cultural argument?
I would take it in a broader and longer argument of that we are living through the kind of rancid back end with what for all of us was a really exciting time in the 1990s of tech utopianism, or at least exploration, not even utopianism. It wasn't like, oh, it's going to be the perfect place, but it's going to be super interesting and we're going to go and poke around and do new things. There's just this sense of there's a tech bummer sense everywhere. You see it in the discourse around AI, and maybe it's deserved. I don't know. And you definitely see it with the way that phones have changed our lives, or have been parallel with changes in our lives that we maybe like, maybe dislike, but it's just different. The thing in your pocket is giving you a majority maybe of your political information at a time when the newspaper industry has been decimated, literally. And so it feels worse, right? It's certainly it must be worse, but then on some levels it doesn't, because it gives you quick information, even if it's not necessarily as reliable as all that when, there's the G train goes out in a fire, as happened this morning. When my daughter was on it, she was probably scrolling infinitely on her phone while it happened. But so I think it's that context, the narrow sort of this social media gave us Trump, and so therefore it's bad. I'm not so interested in those arguments. It's pretty short term thinking. But I think that there is a sense that we are pulling back. A whole lot of us who have two kids, the first one got the phone, the second one didn't, or at least won't. And you're going to fight that tooth and nail until the end. And that is normal stuff, as Catherine has pointed out before. We're adapting to how these tools are going to be used and probably coming up with a better idea. I just hope in the middle of that, or in the process of that, we don't really make bad law and we don't restrict our individual liberties.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, part of what's ironic about this is that, as always, government action is coming at the end of the wave here. It's sort of following the culture rather than leading it. And this has been true with so many of the cases against big tech going back decades. You look at the antitrust cases against IBM, which by the time that was over, Microsoft and Apple were the hot new things in town. The antitrust case against Microsoft was predicated on this idea that no one would ever have anything beyond a desktop computer, and therefore the government had to break up Microsoft and tell it what to do. And then what happened there? They just didn't predict that the handheld thing would come along, right? That we would have phones and that Microsoft would not be the leader there. Government was late to the game every single time. I think that's exactly what is happening here, because what's coming next? It's AI, right? There's already another new big technology on the horizon, and that's going to change things again. In any case, the next steps here are that Meta has said it's going to appeal the New Mexico verdict. And there's all these other social media addiction lawsuits, including a jury trial just wrapped in Los Angeles. Don't know the results of that yet. But this is not over. However, this segment is. We're going to come right back in just a moment with some talk about Iran. Hey, Reason Roundtable listeners. Do you know a student looking for serious intellectual experience? Hey, Reason Roundtable listeners, do you know a student looking for a serious intellectual experience that strengthens the foundations of a free society? Reliance College invites students ages 16 to 24 to the 2026 Great Connection Seminar in Chicago. It's from July 26th to August 2nd this summer. This year's theme is Reason and Love. It explores the ideas that shape character, choice, and human flourishing. Students engage directly with thinkers like Aristotle, Ayn Rand, and Alexis de Tocqueville. They're in small, dynamic discussion groups. Every claim requires evidence and reasoning. They don't just sit through lectures, they practice thinking for themselves. Outside the seminar room, students explore Chicago's cultural landmarks, analyze art firsthand, experience live improv comedy, and build friendships rooted in shared intellectual ambition. Parents, if you want your student equipped to reason independently, to speak confidently, and contribute meaningfully to a free society, this program was built just for them. Registration is just $900, including room for the full week, and scholarships are available. Visit reliancecollege.org/reason to learn more and apply. That's reliancecollege.org/reason. All right. I hope that you've all had a chance to check your phones, because now we're going to talk about ground troops in Iran. Kind of looks like Donald Trump may or may not be sending. This is hard to tell, right? You've got multiple reports saying that the military is sending thousands and thousands of troops, that there's 10,000 more troops in the Middle East than there normally are. Supposedly, this is not going to be a full-on invasion, just limited tactical operations, whatever that means. Donald Trump is, yeah, just right, the tip of the spear. Tip of the spear. That's what they call it. I have no idea what your reference was.
Okay, spears.
No idea at all, right? But you've got these sort of two different stories going on right now, Matt. One is Trump is saying, look, the war is basically over. It's going tremendously well, or whatever he's saying. And also he's saying, but maybe we're going to call in the troops.
I mean, what he said this morning, which we should, I know it's the president, it's Trump, and he says stuff and we don't get excited about it, but literally said, if the Hormuz Strait is not immediately open for business, we will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and Karg Island, and possibly all desalinization plants, which we have purposely not yet touched. So the president's out here just absolutely threatening war crimes. Internationally recognized war crimes of, we're going to get rid of your drinking water if you don't open up the Strait of Hormuz, which had been open 5 weeks ago. There's a timeline here that I think is important that speaks to the president's credibility. 4 weeks ago, he said, we always thought this was a 4 to 5 week deal. Okay, sounds like we're maybe wrapping up. 3 weeks ago, he says, we're ahead of our initial timeline by a lot, and it could be over very soon. Okay, here we go. 2 weeks ago, he says, I've met my own goals. We're weeks, plural, ahead of schedule. So that, though, okay, that's going to end any minute now. That's
what I tell Catherine when I'm working on a magazine article.
Lies, both cases.
Last week on Thursday in the cabinet, he said, we estimated it would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve our mission, and we're way ahead of schedule. Okay, the 4 week thing's coming up. And Marco Rubio today, Secretary of State, came out with one of his very stereotypically Marco Rubio, like, we've been saying the same thing all along here, people, about what the goals of the operation are. And his quote was, it's going to end in a number of weeks, not a number of months. All of that is not just to say that the president is behaving in an erratic and inconsistent way, and that the plans are not really gelling together as previously thought, but also that the war creates unplanned or unpredictable consequences. They didn't think it through. They just didn't. You can have your own sense of why this war might be to this day useful or righteous or etc. It's not going according to plan. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. The president is threatening war crimes, and there are thousands of troops going there for a limited attempt to get rid of the uranium or whatever else they're going to try to do. We're hurtling towards a quagmire and potentially kind of big explodey type of conflicts.
Big explodey type of conflict, Nick. Yeah. I think that's the formal.
That's the technical language. Yeah.
That's what we have to call it now, because legally, if you call it war, then Congress has to weigh in, right?
Yeah.
And Congress, they're not going to do that.
Matt mentioned Marco Rubio, who also tweeted out today the goals. I think there were 4 goals, and all of them in the war, in the conflict with Iran. And it was all, we're just going to blow up a bunch of stuff, which is different.
Also, we're going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, right?
Yeah.
We're going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, but this is a thing that they've said.
Yeah.
And we're going to reopen the thing that was closed because we started the war.
That's right, which Iran never thought to put a gate on, to like put the latch on, even during, previous wars in the region, which, you got to thank Donald Trump. Like, he really is a disruptor in that sense. He brings out something new in everybody. But we don't know what the goal is other than to bring Iran to the bargaining table at this point. And it's like they were literally at the bargaining table like hours before the bombing started. If free speech is kind of in a recession around the globe, and it's very redolent of what we encountered in the 90s. We are back to the 90s in terms of, Gulf War rhetoric and things like that, or the early 2000s, where we don't know what the goals are. We don't know, what we're doing there, what the mission is, when we will know it ended. And as important, or more important, and this is the new twist, nobody believes what Donald Trump is saying. And that's not because people hate Donald Trump. It's because he is a liar and a bullshit artist. And Iran is saying they're not negotiating. He's saying they are negotiating, et cetera. Realistically, when even, everybody who's a patriot has no idea whether or not the president is just lying about something like this, we are in a really, really terrible situation. This is also like the free speech recession. This is like an all hands situation. We need to do something to pressure the government. First and foremost, I would think to stop bombing Iran, but then to actually clarify terms and to bring that, the Senate. I guess last week we talked about TSA, like Congress isn't even in session, and they are like, there's all kinds of pressing domestic concerns that they need to deal with. And it's like, it's a bad time.
Congress isn't in session, and that's you can tell because it's the same as always, right? Speaking of the 90s and the Gulf War, Catherine, Matt Continetti, who both you and I know, wrote in the Wall Street Journal today or this weekend that the worst thing President Trump could do now is to call off the military campaign prematurely. And he specifically compared this to Desert Storm in 1991. He said, because we didn't finish that job, we left Saddam Hussein in power, we had to go back and do it again. And what you don't want out of a war like this is to first destabilize the region and then leave it destabilized and have to come and do a second war a decade later.
He's so close, right? Like, what he just said is correct in many ways, which is the argument for not getting into all of this in the first place. And this is, I don't know that Continetti currently identifies as a neocon. He and I, as you mentioned, worked together at the Weekly Standard back in the day, and we are friends. But this is the fundamental kind of error in the logic of so many people who do want to see the U.S. engaged in some kind of armed conflict in the Middle East. Is there is no end game where we really, really end it. Like, Trump has said that he has killed or is going to kill the past, present, and future of the Iranian leadership, but you can't. There's always somebody else who will take over and who will be mad that you killed his father and bombed his village and murdered all his friends. And maybe the war doesn't take a conventional form forever and ever, but it does we keep generating enemies. And this is like, on the simplest form, it's the backlash theory, but it can be so much more complicated. I do think like a particular mistake we've made in terms of achieving the Continetti vision here in some kind of way is twice we have brought Iran to the negotiating table as a pretext for bombing them. Or we have bombed them as negotiations were beginning, or Israel has, and then we have sent confusing messages about whether the United States government knew that was happening, gave the green light for that to happen, was complicit in that happening. And so I don't know why they would come back to the negotiating table. That would be stupid. And this does have to be a negotiated end. But even if we negotiate an end to the war will not really be over. And that's on the Hawks.
Can I speak to the Operation Finish the Job revisionism about the Gulf War? Because it comes up over and over again.
Yeah.
It's not true that we didn't finish the job. The job was to expel Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, a neighboring smaller country that he took over by armed force. We said, please get out.
Please.
Now. And he didn't. And so an international coalition expelled him. In the process of that, George H.W. Bush spent a lot of time calling him Hitler and bringing up Munich and talking about appeasement. And so it got a lot of people excited about we're going to go after Hitler. We finished that job, encouraged some people to revolt, and then said, stop. That encouragement of them to revolt and giving them the false expectation that we were going to have their back in the Civil War, that was a mistake. To do that, and then it gave rise to this idea that we went half measure. There wasn't a single person in the administration who was advocating going all the way to Baghdad. It didn't happen. Everyone understood that the job was to get him out of Kuwait. They did. It was over. And that was it. What that did, though, this sort of lingering, very neocon project of Operation Finish the Job, it's like, okay, well, then let's do a no-fly zone and let's do super aggressive and intrusive weapons inspections and do this and that and the other that violated Iraq's sovereignty. And Saddam is a horrible, horrible person who deserves, everything he's receiving in hell. But also, that's kind of a new step for a country to volunteer itself to be the one that decides whether you can fly your own airspace based on its fears about your developing a weapon. These kind of things then repeat. And that's kind of what we're seeing here now. We are the unilateral and sporadic and erratic enforcer of nuclear nonproliferation. And we'll just go ahead and go to war in your country for doing that. And that's not, I don't think, a smart way to achieve lasting peace.
If I can just drill just a little bit on what Matt said, actually H.W. Bush and his administration, they were not, they obviously led the Gulf War, but people like Brent Scowcroft and James Baker, they were realists. They were not neocons, and they were not saying we need to have an ever larger and more ubiquitous presence in the Middle East. They were the exact opposite of that, and they were pilloried for that. It's probably one of the reasons why Bush lost, and it was Bill Clinton and Al Gore and people who later in the 90s said that the official goal of America foreign policy in Iraq was regime change. That came in before George W. Bush. And I just say that because the hawks, and this is really important, people like Matt Continenti and people who were at the Weekly Standard, not including Catherine, of course, at the time, they got exactly what they wanted. They got a massive conflagration, which was about regime change and about occupying Iraq for 1,000 years if they want. And God damn it, if the people of Iraq didn't tell America to get out at a certain point. But like this idea that the real problem with American foreign policy in the 21st century is that we didn't bomb enough countries and we didn't invade or occupy long enough is one of the biggest falsehoods possible. I mean, it is Trumpian in its scope and daring. And to say at any point, well, we started some madman without any plan or without any consultation or without any idea of what the fuck he was doing, started a war. So now I guess we have to finish it. No, that's terrible, terrible foreign policy. The regime in Iran is a horrible, horrible regime. One wants it to end, and one wants it to end as quickly and as peacefully as possible. Donald Trump is not going to accomplish that with the actions he's done here, and his cheerleaders in the press are not going to help bring things to a better, conclusion by egging him on and telling Americans, like, oh, if you're against this, then you are, you're somehow unpatriotic or you're anti-American or anti-peace.
Catherine, you talked about backlash. Nick's talking about people who are not neocons. You know what that makes me think of is the new right. Is the new right, which is in many ways a backlash to the neocon dominance of the Republican Party during the George W. Bush era when you were at the Weekly Standard, right? And the folks who have taken over the MAGA Republican Party, they don't like this war. Megyn Kelly, Matt Walsh, not Matt Welch, Matt Walsh, have actually been pretty outspoken about how they think this war is going badly and was a bad idea, and we need to get out of Iran and fix problems at home. What do you make of this populist MAGA backlash to a war that was pretty clearly just a unilateral Donald Trump whim project?
I actually would take a little bit of issue with the last thing you just said, because and similarly, for me related reasons, we are kind of talking about previous wars as the work of neocons in the Weekly Standard and all that.
I'm glad you're taking responsibility.
I always do. And I I think it is important to note, like, this is also just kind of like conventional wisdom in the foreign policy establishment. Like, the conditions for we're going to have to go to war in Iran eventually were very much in place. And Donald Trump did not invent that. He pulled the trigger this time. For sure. And he could have not, right? We could have easily gone another administration or a decade or who knows how long without having this war. But it's not, he didn't make it up out of whole cloth. And there are always people, and have been for decades, people who are very mainstream and very much just a part of the apparatus of our foreign policy who have wanted this war or some version of this war for a very long time and created the conditions that made it more likely with stuff like embargoes, with inspections, as we mentioned earlier. Iran gets those too, and or we would like to have them, and sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. So I guess I would just first say, like, I think that is a baseline condition, and it isn't just Donald Trump woke up and had the war. But
just briefly, though, Donald Trump didn't just wake up and imagine this out of whole cloth. The idea was very much in circulation in American political circles, but he ran against the war and he surrounded himself with people like J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller, who, whatever else you think about them, and I think many, many negative things about both of those guys, there is a long record of both of them saying, we absolutely will not, under any circumstances, do a forever war in Iran.
Presidents do love to be saying he kept us out of the war and then getting into the war. Like, they just do that. Like, I don't know. And I think, I am willing to accept a certain amount of strange bedfellowy with the sort of disappointed new rights on foreign policy. But of course, they immediately diverge from me and I think from us by saying, oh, well, when I said focus on things here at home, I meant kick out all the immigrants and do an insane trade policy. So it only goes so far.
And we are only going to go so far with this segment. We're going to move on to our listener question from Henry. But first, a reminder, we love to answer your questions. Please send your short, succinct, pithy, and otherwise not very long questions to podcasts@reason.com. That's podcasts@reason.com. And please put the words listener question in the subject line. Listener question. That means I know that it's a listener question and not spam. All right, so this week's listener question comes from Henry in the UK, who writes, since the pandemic, I've become more involved in my community. Good for you. I have a couple of voluntary roles. I've come to know my neighbors, and I'm employed by a charity that helps local people in difficult times. I get to be part of something good and worthwhile. It is immensely satisfying. I think that this is what some voters picture when they hear Zoran Mamdani, new mayor of New York, praise the warmth of collectivism. If so, perhaps this is an area where freedom-minded people can meet those voters on ends while disagreeing on means. As Reason video star Andrew Heaton says, government can't love you. How would you persuade a Mamdani voter that community and human connection are best created by free individuals and not government? Matt Welch, you live in Zoran Mamdani's New York. And you like community.
I absolutely love what you're doing out there, Henry, and recommend it to everyone, starting with myself, to do more things like that. And I just would separate that type of activity and the insights that you learn from politics, because you're going to get frustrated. Like, I also appreciate, like, how would you talk to my mom? Donnie used the word collectivism for a reason. He writes his speeches, and you can tell when he's getting excited about it. He used a phrase that was rightly toxic for many, many decades, scores of years, deservedly so, because collectivism has been one of the greatest evils of the 20th century and beyond. And now he's going to make this a warmth and cuddly thing. So regardless of how people heard it, that's where he was coming from. It's like, cool, I'm going to repurpose the word, make it sexy and daring. I hate that. And want to first say collectivism really sucks. So yes, it's always great to persuade and talk to your fellow people about how it's good to do local things and get involved in your community and go to the school board meeting if you have to, and go to your church and go and pick up trash along the Gowanus Canal. All that stuff. Awesome. Super great. And at the same time, the way that collectivism, even if it's understood in a softer term, usually means around these parts. I will want to raise taxes on billionaires so that I can spend that money in purely symbolic ways, punishing people I don't like and pretending to help, or making a gesture that I'm helping favored groups, and then not really following up to see whether that money is well spent. I'm not really here for that. I'm here for the good stuff that you're doing.
Well, Nick, doesn't that just suggest that maybe libertarians need to retake the word collectivism, and instead of it being, stuff we're going to tax you and take your money at the point of a gun to do, it's stuff you choose to do together voluntarily?
I mean, I think libertarians are having enough trouble, keeping the term libertarian. So, for people obsessed with property rights, we really are pretty bad at this. And one of the first things I wrote for Reason, this would have been sometime in the mid-90s, was about how we lost the term liberal, So, but for me,
but then we got the term libertarian.
Yeah, that's right. So it all works out in the end.
That group.
Part of the other longer phrase from Mamdani's, I was going to say induction speech, because he was kind of drafting us all, but that there was no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about. That's actually the part that kind of susses out the warmth of collectivism, is that if he gets his way, you will never be able to make a decision without having to run it by Zoran Mamdani or, his housing advisor who, Reason interviewed years before, and it was insane, just has no idea of how governments build housing and how governments pay for housing and things like that. So to get to the questioner's point, I think we need to talk more and more about the things that people do apart from the government. And there are certain things, and I might disagree with some of the people on this podcast, there are certain large policy things that government, only government can do, or government is better suited for that. And that includes, setting zoning laws if we're going to have zoning, or, having certain types of grants that allow for certain types of educational opportunities and things like that. Let government deal with the bigger stuff, like are the roads being paved and things like that. And then we really need to pull it back more into, the neighborhoods and to the voluntary action that actually helps people, to do that things that really are too small for government to care about.
Catherine, this is a you can just do things question, right?
Yeah. And one of the things you could just do is get together with your buddies in the community and build a road. That's all I'm saying. I'm just throwing that out there.
Good luck with that.
It's a you can just do things question. People throw around this term, right? And it's you can just do things, and it's a tech bro kind of concept of you can just build it yourself. And mostly what they're talking about is you can vibe code $1 billion business, but you can also start a garden club. And when I was 15, I did yard work for the community garden club in Niceville, Florida. It was a part of Niceville, Florida. It was a bunch of old ladies who just needed a 15-year-old boy to hack at the roots. It was great. They paid me money.
I'm sure they were looking at you lasciviously.
They planted beautiful bushes all around the neighborhood.
Beautiful bushes.
It was a nicer neighborhood because they had chosen to get together and just do things to make it nicer.
I did accidentally just do things. I cut down a bunch of bushes at my house, and then I didn't know what they were. And the ones that were left bloomed, and they were really nice, and I wish I hadn't cut them down. So sometimes you just do things wrong, and that's okay too. Because if it's just you and not the government, you live with your own mistakes.
And that's it. That's what Henry should say to the Mamdani voters.
Yeah.
And Catherine, you need to use the little plant apps, and it'll tell you about if it's an invasive species.
They were forsythia, so they was legit beautiful yellow flowers for 5 minutes right now, and then they're going to look like scraggly garbage for the rest of the year.
You can just buy 10 movie tickets for your friends and colleagues and go see Project Hail Mary.
Yes, we are going to do that.
Which Catherine and 8 other people from Reason are going to, a bunch of other people from Reason are going to do on Tuesday night of this week. All right, we've got one more topic here. We are 2 months into the standoff over DHS funding. It is the longest shutdown of the agency in history. The TSA lines are also maybe the longest, and certainly in my memory in some of these places, I'm hearing reports of 3 and 5 hour lines at the BWI over the weekend at the Baltimore airport. And immigration agents from ICE are out in force at some of these airports. They're supposed to be helping things along, but there's a report in Wired that says they're not. They're not because they're not trained to do stuff, and also because they're just sort of hanging out, not really doing anything. Catherine, is there any world in which you can imagine ICE being deployed to airports because of long lines, because of a government shutdown of one agency, making things better?
No.
All right. Solved it. That's it. Matt, what should we do about the long TSA lines?
Get rid of the TSA, and get rid of ICE, and then get rid
We're so tired. All of us are like, I don't know. This is just really bad.
No,
Let's stop doing it.
About this last week. It all,
we did.
All of it sucks. All of it sucks. I have my aforementioned 17-year-old female in my household is taking her spring break class trip to Japan on, I think, Thursday or Wednesday afternoon.
And they're lining up on Monday.
7 a.m. is when they're assembling at the 7. I'm going to get a teenager to JFK at 7 a.m. because of the TSA. So I'm ready to do terrorism.
He's kidding.
Don't say that while you're in the TSA line is my main recommendation here. Nick, what do you make of the political situation here, right? The underlying argument about DHS and the funding here. I just want to read you some Trump quotes. These are all pulled from a Guardian article. But Trump's like, this is an unprecedented emergency situation. He blamed Democrats and their reckless decision to prioritize criminal illegal aliens over American citizens for the shutdown. If Democrats in Congress will not act to honor the service of our TSA officers, then my administration is going to take action. And Trump is saying, hey, he signed something last week. It's like, we're just going to pay him anyway. He's not saying what funding he's going to use, what pot of money. Can he do that? Isn't Congress supposed to be the only part of the government that has the power of the purse?
One of the things that, that is clarifying about Trump, and we kind of owe him a thank you for this, which is he's showing it, whatever the laws are, whatever the customs are, it's really what you can get away with. So Trump could do that. It'll get tied up in courts. Eventually it'll be found that he violated policy. But by then, it's after the fact. And in a certain level, what Trump has done, and people talked about this, towards the end of his first term, he is stress testing all aspects of kind of American governance. And he has moved on from, I think, specifically legal challenges to more kind of cultural ones within. And, we'll see about that. But I think the bigger thing that we can do, or that we should do, is one, the Senate passed a bill, overwhelmingly, it was like 91 to something, to fund DHS and the TSA to get them back up before their I'm going to call it a recession, but before they recessed. And the House did not vote on that. And it's the Republicans' fault in this sense. And I can remember an argument we had on podcast years ago. The Republicans control the federal government. They are responsible for making sure that a budget gets voted on in a way that precludes this kind of bullshit. They might have to eat a lot of stuff. They might have to twist arms, et cetera, but it's on them. To some degree, it's on the Democrats. I'm not a Democrat, et cetera. But the other thing that we should be doing is reminding ourselves of how bad the TSA is and why they have been for almost their entire existence. They've been objects of derision. We used to, at Reason TV, we could get million viewed videos on YouTube by just saying anything about TSA because people hated TSA. And I hope that this episode reminds us of why people hated the TSA and why we can imagine we lived without the TSA. For 1,000 years, we didn't have TSA. We can look and create a world after TSA, and we should start doing that. And we should start being angry at the TSA people itself. They only work there, but tough nuts.
All right. Like Donald Trump, let's also move on to cultural issues with our What You've Been Watching, Reading, otherwise consuming in the cultural realm. Catherine, let's start with you.
I touched grass. I went to the Cherry Blossom Festival, which I was
hoping it was going to be pot.
I cannot speak to that question, but I went to the Cherry Blossom Festival. And there I was reminded of the possibility of domestic and international peace. People were out in droves. Everybody was doing their best in like terrain that was not meant to be occupied by many, 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 many thousands of people, it seemed. Ladies were in their nice pink dresses. Everybody was politely taking pictures of each other. And of course, the cherry blossoms were a gift of friendship from the Japanese in like 1910. 1912 was when the first one went in. And there's actually a very cool history. So the first batch of cherry blossom trees that we were gifted were full of like some kind of horrific like nematode bug creature or something, and all had to be burned. So actually there was an original tradition that maybe we should bring back, the cherry blossom bonfire, in which we burnt them all.
Should we have maybe tariffed?
No.
Those things before they came in, right? That would
maybe the TSA could have, the customs would have theoretically caught this
Longshoremen's Union.
The point is, those bad boys went in 1912. The original trees are still there. And, we did a war with Japan in the meantime, and then we made up again and still used the trees as a symbol of friendship and peace and renewal. And people were really getting into the spirit. On the token of, are there private solutions to public failures? If you don't like how crowded it is down by the tidal basin where the park police are in charge, turns out there are several little neighborhoods in D.C. where people just privately planted a whole bunch of cherry blossoms, and you can go have the walking amongst the cherry blossoms experience on private or private-ish property, including the Kenwood neighborhood in Maryland. I double cherry blossomed this weekend. I saw them both.
Like a rainbow, like a double rainbow situation?
The Kenwood experience was also really lovely. Again, tourists from all over the place, everybody getting along. I feel that Helen Taft and the Viscountess Chinda, who planted the first two trees, would have been proud of us.
I have a question.
Yes.
Were you wearing a pink dress, or was it all black?
I was wearing black at the cherry blossoms, per my one, but partially because I decided to go spontaneously. Some people had clearly been planning. There was costuming involved. There were kimonos. People were looking excellent. I was just wearing my normal clothes, but I still had a good time.
Speaking of good times for Catherine Mangue-Ward, I read a Neal Stephenson novella, Atmosphera Incognita. This is from 2019. It's an engineering project narrative. It's kind of like an Andy Weir story, except it's only like 50 pages long. And it's about building the tallest building on the planet. So just to give you an idea, the actual, in our real world, tallest building on the planet is the one Tom Cruise climbed in Mission Impossible 4. It's the Burj Khalifa. It's about 830 meters high, so not quite a kilometer, right? Because kilometer is about 1,000 meters. And this is a story about building a building that is 20 kilometers tall, 12 and a half miles. And there are a whole bunch of problems, namely wind, the jet stream, also like the sun, the atmosphere. It gets very complicated. But the biggest problem, it turns out, that Neal Stephenson wants to spend an awful lot of time describing, and bless him for this, the biggest problem is, where do you put the bar? And so like half the story is about figuring out how to have a bar at the top of the world's tallest building. And it starts actually as a lesbian cowgirl bar in a nearby town, and then gets turned into a shipping crate bar, and then they sort of raise it up, and then they have to atmosphere proof it, and they've got to think about there's a big problem with a bar that's 12 and a half miles up in the air, which is gravity doesn't work quite the same way, oxygen doesn't work quite the same way, and you need gravity to do a bunch of bar stuff. Liquid is different when there's not gravity, right? So this is really a story about managing a bar, and also they come to call it the first bar in space. And it's funny, there's like a whole section about how it's like there are people who are arguing that it's not really space, because it's only 7 miles up at first, and then it's 9 miles up, right? And this is a thing where the pedants get really upset about whether or not it's actually space. You can't imagine this happening at all. The first 20 pages are about all of the NIMBY regulations and like different coalitions they have to like go through and the different sites that they're looking at. And they're just like a whole bunch of people band together and we're like, this is a bad idea. The tower might fall over. And they're like, that's not That's not how towers work. This is not going to happen. There are other problems, though. In any case, if you like Neil Stephenson, if you like Andy Weir, if you like tall buildings, and if you like bars, I strongly recommend Atmosphere Incognita. You can download it from Amazon. It's great. It's kind of underappreciated. I did not know about this until recently. But what's even funnier is if you go and read about this, you will find that Neil Stephenson actually tried to build this building. He had a plan to do it around 2012, 2013. And guess what? It didn't work so well. They ran into some engineering problems, so he just decided to write a science fiction story. Matt Welch.
Sometimes you can't do things.
Sometimes you wish that things could not have been done. I saw probably the laziest movie in the history, the most anti-Justine Bateman movie. She's been going on a jihad about make original movies, stop just repurposing old IP. So I saw with my 11-year-old Anaconda with Paul Rudd and Jack Black and Steve Zahn, who's actually really funny. And it's
Big Tommy, by the way, Steve Zahn.
Okay.
Yeah, big Zinn fan.
Just like Jeff Zahn, but a better change-up, I hope. But so this was a comedic meta reboot. And then just knowing that phrase exists makes me want to do terrorism somewhere.
Strangle someone with a snake.
Apparently, there were 7 original Anaconda movies.
Oh, no.
I had heard that there was 1. And I knew enough about it, like, I will never see that.
No, they're like the Leprechaun movies.
There were 7. And this is the story of like failed guys who never really pursued their dreams of going in Hollywood, and they decided to make an indie reboot of Anaconda and then discover that they didn't really have the rights. And it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's incredibly lazy, so cheaply shot. It's like, oh, wherever this was, it certainly wasn't the Amazon River. And sure enough, it's like Australia. It looks like it was made straight for video. There's nothing you could say about it at all that is righteous and artistic, and it was pretty funny. We liked it. I think the moral of the story is like you could put Paul Rudd and Jack Black reading the phone book, and it would probably be pretty funny. And so there's something to that. The end.
Have you seen
Why
the
did
original?
you see that?
It was just because it was like, hey, let's see a movie after dinner. That was it. And so that has Jack Black, and he's funny. Let's look at it. And he was.
I feel like your stories of spontaneous movie going are they're harrowing. Like,
yep.
Every time you say, let's go see a movie, like, terrible things happen.
Yep.
Yeah, the last time we had to explain David Bowie's Magic Balls to you.
Yeah, that was unfortunate for all of us. Nick, what did you watch?
I watched the Hulu series Love Story, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, because I wanted to make sure that it ended with John F. Kennedy Jr.'s death. Quentin
Tarantino had directed it.
Yeah, no, I was afraid of that. I was very disappointed too, because I started binging it. I thought it was a binge thing, and then I got to the end of the first 8 episodes, and it was like the next one will be available to watch in a week, and I was like, God damn it! Like, how did the Kennedys do this to us again and again? And it's a fascinating. It is a terrible TV production that is nonetheless worth watching, or at least dipping into, if only because most of the people involved or depicted in it have laid some kind of claim against it as being very bullshitty. Daryl Hannah, who was John F. Kennedy Jr.'s girlfriend for a while, wrote a New York Times piece denouncing her depiction of it and him and them, etc. But it's a real time capsule of the 90s. And I realize now this is just cheap nostalgia in a way, but John F. Kennedy Jr. was famous in a way that it is hard to be famous anymore, because he was trying to bridge the gap from a pre-kind of internet fame to a post-internet fame. And his, magazines like People and Us Weekly still kind of mattered, or they were able to generate millions and millions of newsstand sales based on who was on the cover, including him and his fiancee, then wife, Carolyn Bessette, who became something of a fashion icon before JFK Jr. killed her sister and himself in a plane accident where he took off and was flying in weather and circumstances that he was not certified to fly in. And in many ways, this is kind of like the end of the Kennedy dynasty, where the Kennedys were famous for, the Kennedy men anyway, were famous for just doing things that they were not necessarily qualified to do or competent in. And so I recommend it. It is a bizarre kind of meditation on a type of fame that doesn't quite exist anymore. And I hope a type of familial, political, or cultural dynasty that does not exist anymore in America. There was something in the 20th century where I think we saw the end of certain things. And, this is why it's good that, the Bush dynasty seems to be dead. The Clinton dynasty, if it ever really got going, is dead. This you can watch and understand where and how family dynasties go to die.
So you're talking about this as a political story, and obviously that's what it is. But
more as a cultural one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is, what do you make of the way that this has been sort of cast as this dreamy, retro, nostalgic look at New York publishing in the 1990s, as well as just New York, where like one of the restaurants featured, a small Chinese restaurant featured, in one of these episodes suddenly has lines or apologies, right? But like one of the kind of small old New York restaurants now has like lines around the block because it was here.
Yeah, that is part of what is fascinating. Is it's on a very large level, and it's intended as a pure nostalgia play, because it is really hard to watch the way John F. Kennedy Jr. lives his life and not be like, God, how did he last long enough to kill himself and two innocent people? Because he just seemed like totally gripless. So part of it is a nostalgia, and New York in the 90s is now distant enough to be like, oh my God, there were, it was scary below 14th Street or something like that, in a way that is wrong, but is understandable. And so it's just getting that gauze. And also, in a weird way, there's like a lot of great speeches, especially after he dies. And then Carolyn Bessette, it's clearly from her kind of perspective, because she's troubled and complicated, but ultimately she is kind of the hero of the piece, much more than JFK Jr. And it's kind of like that world, how tragic and beautiful and flawed it was, that at least made sense in a way that things don't anymore. So in that sense, the cultural nostalgia is for these particular people and this particular place, New York, but also a world that kind of made sense, even if it really doesn't.
Yeah, I see so much nostalgia for that era and for publishing of that era on Substack and in sort of the places where today's younger writers in particular are gathering. And in some ways, I think it's, the nostalgia is misplaced. It wasn't as good as people thought, and in particular, barriers to entry back then. I think of how much my career has relied on the internet and sort of being able to self-publish and kind of come up through those channels, and that was just much less true in the New York publishing era, where George Magazine had to be started by a Kennedy. And you had to be a Kennedy to do it. On the other hand, I kind of get it when you read those reports about the guys who are like, yeah, my job is to write 3 feature stories per year. Maybe one of them doesn't even run, and I get paid $500,000 in 1990s dollars.
Well, this is what's good, to fight against that nostalgia, or at least to unmask it as such. I can remember, Catherine, during when Reason was celebrating its 50th anniversary, and we did a series of interviews, and you interviewed me about what I liked about Reason, or my experience of Reason. And if I'm remembering correctly, the thing about the 90s that was great is that this is the period when the mainstream died and everything became alternative culture. And it was such a better world unless you were the pharaohs who were, like having pyramids built for you. It is so much better. And I apologize for the noise. New York is back in a way that it wasn't in the 90s.
It's back, and it's coming for you.
But it is so much better because it is a world that is hierarchical rather than hierarchical. The barriers to entry on almost every possible level have been smashed and destroyed. And it just means it's a lot more chaotic. It's a lot more unpredictable. And you have to be more responsible as an individual for how things turn out. It's a lot of responsibility. It's hard. It's discombobulating and whatnot. But it is so fundamentally better than a world where, Condé Nast and Hearst Publishing, or Time Life were striding the earth, as giants, and we were all just fleas on their legs.
I'm a little disappointed that you're not wearing a cashmere sweater and a novelty hat, but I guess, you only took the movie so much to heart.
All right, folks, that is our show. If you like the Roundtable, if you like Reason, you can support us by going to reason.com/donate. That is reason.com/donate. Thank you all for listening. Reason out.